what I'm planning to cover in this lecture is a little bit extra compared to what I covered last year, in case some of you also attended this lecture last year. So what I'm going to start off with is just to tell you a bit about how I got involved in actually studying electrodeposition. Electrochemistry in general is my area of expertise. So I did my PhD here in the Department of Chemical Engineering with Professor Jeff Kelsall, looking at recovering nickel from industrial plating wastewater. And now I'm a lecturer here, and now I constantly find that electrodeposition keeps making its way back into my research group and is now actually being done by everybody, whether it's nickel or metals, or we've even started trying to deposit carbon nanotubes now. So I figured I would tell you what my experience has been and where we're going next and what sort of things we learned along the way. So we'll cover, of course, some of the applications of electrodeposition, right? What it's actually for, why is it such a big field, and then how do we go about actually predicting suitable conditions for electrodeposition. So there is a lot of literature out there for all kinds of plating baths, depending on what you want to deposit, and it's not normal to report a whole systematic study anymore of how electrodeposition was carried out. So normally you just get a set of instructions of what plating bath was used, what potential was applied, and some pictures of what the deposit looks like. And that doesn't really help to learn about how to go about planning an electrodeposition experiment. So we'll look at some thermodynamics, and then moving on from that, we'll look at actual experiments involving electrodeposition, how to go about it, also what can go wrong, which is a lot of different things, and finally, what sort of strategies there are to actually control electrodeposition. So do you want to apply a constant potential? Do you want to apply a constant current? Do you want to pulse either the potential or the current and electroplate intermittently? So all of that. So I'll try and go over that today. I just want to briefly mention that I will have to go just a bit before 2 o'clock because I'm expected in the other lecture theatre in this department for a distinguished seminar series that I'm hosting, and it would be very rude for me to be late. So I'll have to leave probably at about 10 to 2, but I hope to cover most of what I plan to tell you within that time period. I'm perfectly happy to be interrupted with questions. So we've got some of my research group sitting in the audience, so they will keep an eye out for questions that come up online. So as the question as you think of a question, please just put it in the chat, and either Namkang or Derek will read it out to me, and we can cover it on the spot. Okay, so you don't have to leave it till the end to ask the questions. So my first experience of electroplating came about during my PhD project, where the task of my project, it wasn't the case initially, but we were approached by a representative of the Royal Mint, or rather a third party working with the Royal Mint, who carry out electroplating of coins. So this isn't British coins, they do all kinds of different denominations, but they had a really big business in electroplating steel blanks, and they were generating lots of nickel waste solution. And the task was, well, there's a lot of nickel waste in here. We need to get it out somehow because it's toxic, and there's a lot of nickel contained within. So can you help us? So the focus of recovering nickel was the subject of my PhD. So the background to electroplating is as follows. Oh, that looks a little bit blurry, but hopefully you can see. So the purpose of plating in general, whether it's nickel or anything else, and also whether you do it electrochemically or electrolytically, is that you're trying to generate a coating, usually metallic, but not always, that is metallurgically bonded to the substrate onto which you're applying it, right? So you have an object, and you electrodeposit a metal on top of it, and that layer is metallurgically attached to the substrate. So why would you want to do that? So there are lots of examples of where depositing thin layers of metals onto less valuable substrates allows you to meet a lot of different requirements. So for example, electrodeposited coatings are used in the aerospace and motor industries, where engines, turbines, compressor blades, pumps, valves, nuts and bolts, you name it, are plated for protection against corrosion, to which they're subjected in the environments that they're actually used in. Right? You can use electrodeposition to generate a coating that could be an undercoat for another more valuable material. So, for example, if you're plating nickel, it could be used as an undercoat for gold, tin, rhodium, and chromium plating because it creates a better metallurgical bond with different substrates, and so you would sequentially electrodeposit progressively more noble materials on top of each other until you get the finish that you want. You can co-electrodeposit different materials together to generate alloys. An example would be co-electrodeposition of nickel, iron, and cobalt, which produces alloys with which are alloys with magnetic properties. And in the example that I've got here from the Royal Mint, they were electrodepositing nickel onto steel blanks. So these basically coins made of steel, solid steel, were the starting point for making coins of a particular denomination. And then they were progressively plated with more and more valuable metals, but nickel was the first one. And so the idea of electroplating in general, whether it's nickel or anything, is that you have a substrate that you're actually coating, right? So usually it's a cathode, because usually electroplating is a reductive process where metal ions from solution are reduced to the elemental form. You can sometimes plate out metals oxidatively, where they oxidize to form an oxide coating, but that's much less common. So usually you reduce metal ions to generate a metallic coating. So that happens at the cathode. And the cathode, as well as the anode, are immersed in a plating bath where the metal ions that you're wanting to reduce are essentially floating about. Now, if you start to electroplate ions out of the solution, their concentration will deplete. So in order to prevent that, you will have a metal anode. For example, if you're plating nickel, you will have a nickel anode that steadily dissolves to replenish the concentration of the ions that you are reducing. So you're going from essentially a solid metal anode into dissolved ions in solution, and then forming a very nicely controlled thin coating on the cathode. And the idea is that the reduction in oxidation rates are balanced, so that the plating bath that you've got essentially remains chemically constant in terms of its chemical composition indefinitely, right? But of course, that's not quite how it works, and we'll come on to that. But I just want to tell you how electroplating of coins works, because I went to the Royal Mint at the start of this PhD project, and it was really, really interesting. So when you learn about electrodeposition from textbooks or anything like that, you normally see a sketch like I showed in the first picture. So just a solid lump of metal being coated with something. But of course, in reality, you want to coat complex objects, with complex geometries, complex structures, and they can be huge in size, like engines, or they could be really small, like coins. So it's not always appropriate to just make an electronic contact to the object that you're plating and then do the same thing for objects, for every single object, because something like coins are very, very small. So if you were to plate one coin at a time, you're not going to get very far, right? So the way coins are plated at the Royal Mint is a process called barrel plating. So you have something like 80 kilograms worth of steel blanks. I think it amounts to something like 100,000 coins, are placed in propylene baskets. And the baskets have a central conductive rod, a copper rod, running through the middle of them. And the idea is that the basket can be rotated, and the coins, they tumble about. And so when you do the electroplating, the actual electroplating, this entire basket is immersed into this great big plating tank filled with aqueous solution containing a nickel salt. at the edges along the walls of the basket, you have little spheres in fabric bags made of nickel. So they're your anodes that are permanently in the plating tank. And then you immerse the basket containing these coins that you want to plate into the plating bath. And then the basket starts rotating. So the coins start tumbling about, and the plating happens when the coins touch the central rod through to which current is being applied. So it's kind of like intermittent plating, but it has the effect of homogenizing the rate at which each individual coin is being plated, right? This intermittency. And so besides the nickel plating tank, you basically have this array of tanks through which the plated, or the objects that have to be plated have to pass through. So it starts off with some etching of the steel blanks, cleaning, drying, rinsing, and then eventually they make their way into this dark green tank for the actual plating. After the plating is finished, they need to be rinsed. So you have these different rinsing stages where you can see that the nickel solution is becoming progressively lighter. So it's coming off the coins. And then you have to do all kinds of post-treatment things that I won't mention, but essentially it also involves drying, bombarding the coins with particles to check adhesion, and so on and so forth. And then you would repeat that for any other metal that you might want to deposit on top of the nickel. And so this process was going great, and the plating of the coins that looked really nice and shiny, they showed us some of it. It lies around all over the place. But the problem is that the composition of the plating bath was not constant with time like it was supposed to be. And what was happening is that the salt from which nickel was actually derived, so it was nickel sulfamate, the sulfamate ions underwent hydrolysis to form some ammonium. And this was happening at quite low pH, so pH 2 originally. And what they found is that the plating bath composition changed so quickly, and the quality of the deposits went down very quickly together with that. So they ended up having to replace the plating solution all the time, and they were generating 2 of these cubic meters. This is just an image showing an example of a IBC container. It's 1 cubic meter. And they were generating 2 of these per week, so containing nickel in molar concentrations. So it was quite an incredible amount of nickel. And so the task for my PhD was how to recover that nickel, also by electroplating, but without the nickel dissolving from any anodes, because you want to get the concentration down. It was to recover the nickel because the value of the nickel contained in the effluent was a lot. And also nickel made this waste water very toxic. So nickel is a carcinogen, and there are strict limits imposed on its discharge into sewers. So this is how I came to learn about electrodeposition. And so just in a nutshell, what my PhD project involved is it involved, first of all, getting samples of the effluent from the Royal Mint, but of course, that contained all kinds of stuff besides nickel. It contained iron, it contained rust, and all the other stuff that might end up in wastewater. So what we did is we simulated the wastewater by making quite a pure solution. So we bought some nice pure nickel sulfamate salts, and we made our own plating bath, and we studied how nickel electrodeposition actually works. And we did this on a small scale, starting from thermodynamics and microkinetic investigations. We looked at all the mechanisms being proposed for nickel reduction. It's not a process where 2 electrons are transferred all at the same time. It's actually a sequence of steps. And so we try to understand how it actually works in order to determine the best conditions for recovering this nickel. So after the small-scale experiments, we moved on to designing a bench-scale battery circulation system to see how effectively we can recover the nickel in such a reactor. And so this involved modeling, a zero-dimensional model of, where you model the volume of your electrolyte, how the concentration will decrease with time, what current to apply to make the reduction happen, and how to control the process altogether. So not just looking at reactions for nickel, but all the reactions in the system. And finally, we built a pilot plant, which we tested in Wales. Derek, you've got a question?
Yeah, the question is, how did Royal know when to stop the plating?
Right. Right, so that definitely did happen. So I guess they do that from experience, because I think it from what I understood, this process involved a lot of trial and error. So for example, when we asked them, why do you use pH 2 when it accelerates the degradation of your plating bath, they said, yes, good point. And subsequently they switched to pH 4. Oh. So it showed that I think they kind of get used to how things should work, and they have a certain expectation of how many coins, how much current to pass, and then they regularly test the chemical composition of the plating bath. So they come and they take a sample, so they look at that to see if there are traces of, you know, the contaminants that they expect. So you could do it that way, and also they have rigorous monitoring of the coins as they come off the plating. So they end up, you know, it's I guess it's kind of like, you know, those videos where tomatoes are falling down and there's this automated flap, yeah, that gets rid of this. Probably less sophisticated, but they also have, you know, rigorous checks on the deposits that come off. So if they, you know, you end up presumably having to discard or etch away the nickel deposit and start again, having replaced the bath. So I imagine it's a combination of steps.
And there is a tolerance of the
yeah.
So I thought they have like exact design of like dynamics of the rolling plating. No, I just like,
no, I don't think so. I think it's well, I didn't get the impression that they did. And also they had some failed attempts with recovering the nickel previously. So they were not entirely optimistic when we took on the project, because we bought another cell. It was supposed to spiral the electrolyte, and it didn't work. So anyway, so I guess I mean, my task today is not to tell you specifically about my PhD, because my PhD was about recovering nickel, and most electrodeposition is where you actually you don't want to deplete the nickel or any kind of metal from the solution. You want to plate it in the most reproducible, constant way possible so that you get the desired deposit. Whereas in my PhD, we didn't care so much about the deposit, so which I'll show you now. So this is just some more photographs of the pilot plant that we built. It was able to process 25 liters of nickel effluent over a week. So this would ultimately need to be scaled up even further to do the job faster. But the electrode on which we deposited the nickel was this really nice nickel mesh that we show on the left. And it was a mesh instead of a plate, because the adhesion of the nickel from the wastewater to a mesh was much more uniform. And on a plate, it was really rugged and kept flaking off. So we used a mesh. And it also enhanced mass transport in the system. And you can see that by the end of the plating, the deposited nickel, you know, this kind of morphology is not very nice. It's all full of nodules and lumps and bumps, and that's because we pushed the process close to mass transport control. So there were lots of factors that make the deposit morphology not something that you would desire in a normal application, but for us it was okay, because for us it was just the recovery that was important, and afterwards the plan was, well, not for me, but ultimately the idea was that you can take this deposit and melt it down and reform it into whatever morphology you might like. Okay, so I anticipated that I would have less audience than last year, but just to explain how I tailored my talk. So last year I did this entire presentation online, and in order to sort of break up the talk a bit, I asked the audience who actually does electroplating. And the answer was that no one, or at least from last year's audience, actually did it as a full-time project, either PhD or postdoc or whatever. So in fact, the majority of the audience hadn't even tried it before, but they were just interested in learning about it. And some of the audience kind of encounter it as part of the project. So let's say you can't buy something, but you know that you can make it by electrodeposition. So it's kind of a side project to their main project. So We have an audience of 4, so who here does electrodeposition?
I
Just started to do it.
Kind of core of my work.
It's not, or
it is.
It is.
Yeah,
It is.
just got started.
Okay, we can have a chat afterwards. Okay, so 2 people in the audience. That's really cool. That's nice. I'm not going to do this thing now because otherwise I'll get too distracted. But anyway, so this is kind of the level at which I'm pitching my talk. So not a super experienced audience, because to be honest, I'm not super experienced myself. So I don't have experience of electrodepositing all kinds of different, pristinely smooth metals or interesting morphologies. I just have experience of how to go about approaching such a task. So if you had a choice, so let's say forget the plating wastewater now, that's just a background to the project. But let's say you have a problem, you decide, okay, I want to electrodeposit some gold. We can't wait for the supplier, we just need some an electrode that's gold, but we can't buy it, but we can make it at home, we can make it ourselves, or nickel or silver or anything. The starting point is, how do you decide on the right composition for the plating bath? Because when you start reading textbooks, and I always, by the way, recommend reading textbooks if you're trying to learn anything new about electrochemistry or anything, in fact. So learning from papers, learning fundamentals from papers is not a very good idea. This is one of the main things I can tell you I discovered throughout my career. Because the goal of papers isn't really to properly explain why this was done. They're just reporting the best findings. And sometimes in good papers they say, let us also tell you what didn't work. But most of the time papers try and be concise, and they're just reporting what did work. And you don't get told, why did you do this? Why did you add this chemical? Why did you choose this particular condition? Why not any other? So you end up, putting a table together of who used what condition. You get a wide spread of values, but without really properly understanding why something is the case. So I encountered this when I did my PhD, and so I went to textbooks and pored over them for a good few months, actually, to try and understand the fundamentals. And this was also very much encouraged by Jeff Kelsall, who doesn't like random trial and error approaches. He likes a very systematic way of approaching projects. So you need to decide on the composition of the solution. So my talk is limited to aqueous systems, so I know you can do also electrodeposition from organic solvents. You can do it from ionic liquids and so on. I don't have very much experience with that, so that's going to be outside of my talk today. Not that I'm not interested, but I'm not going to cover that. But so you're starting with water, and if you want to plate silver, for example, you need to put in silver in in the form of a salt. Like, I don't know, silver chloride or something like that, right? You need to introduce it into the solution so that it's there in the form of ions, and you can then reduce it to form a coating on the cathode, right? So you need to introduce the metal salt. You also need to introduce something called a supporting electrolyte, which is something Jason Riley talked about in the first lecture that he gave for this course. I highly recommend it. So that's just some salt that's electrochemically inert, i.e. doesn't participate in electrochemical reactions, but it increases the overall conductivity of the plating bath, and it stops the generation of gradients of cations and anions that would actually distort the whole measurement in the system. And then you have things like, you need to consider what pH you're going to tune your solution to, so you can add your silver and a salt and so on. But pH is a very big factor for, well, actually any electrochemical reaction, so I'll explain why that is. You might need a buffer to stop any pH changes that occur during electrochemical reactions from then influencing those same electrochemical reactions, i.e. so you have non-constant conditions. So keeping an eye on pH, and something called complexing agents. So we're coming across that a lot now in the research in my group, where we're looking again at nickel deposition, but we're trying to get a nice, very smooth nickel deposit. And it turns out you need lots of complexing agents. And initially, it's not clear why you need them. So I'll show why they are important and how to look at what they're actually expected to do. So the first question is, if you make up your solution, right? This is very basic, by the way, but you make up your solution. What are the chemical reactions that you might expect to occur in it? Because electrochemistry is also influenced by the chemical composition of the solution, obviously, but the chemical composition might change. And so to estimate how it might change and what sort of conditions you're desperately trying to avoid, you need to understand, first of all, what chemical reactions can actually occur. So to do this, we normally go to some authoritative textbooks, such as Standard Potentials and Aqueous Solutions. I think that's a very famous book that every electrochemistry professor has, I suspect. And this book contains Gibbs free energy of different species of metals, or, well, actually not just metals, but anything of elements. But specifically for electroplating, you'd be interested in metals. So it has different species of copper, different species of nickel, of gold. And you have to open the one that relates to the system that you actually want. And what you're looking for is the forms of that metal that might realistically occur in your solution. And that depends partly in what form you've actually added that material to the solution in the first place. So if you've added nickel in the form of nickel chloride, you might be interested in any nickel chloride complexes, right? If you didn't add nickel as a chloride, you're not interested in nickel chloride complexes because you don't have chloride, but you might, for example, have nickel sulfate complexes and so on. So you're trying to find all the different forms in which the metals can exist. So when you open the textbook to get the Gibbs free energies, it looks something like this. So it has many more species than might realistically occur in the solution. And one art I haven't quite learned yet is to decide which of these species are actually stable in aqueous solutions, which ones might occur, and yeah, how to go about figuring out what's what. But the simplest way is, for example, if you're adding nickel as a chloride or as a sulfate, you expect that to dissociate in water and you expect it to form nickel 2+. Right? That's what you hope. You're also going to reduce that to elemental nickel, so nickel naught. So you're interested in that. If and then you say, okay, so I'm going from nickel 2+ to nickel naught. If I've got nickel 2+, that's an oxidation state of 2+. What other species are there in this table that are the same oxidation state? Because those are the ones with which nickel 2+ might have form a chemical equilibrium. And in this case, I mean, we could talk about this for hours, how to go through all of these different species and decide what's relevant. But in this case, what's relevant to us is elemental nickel, nickel 2+, and nickel hydroxide, right? And also, if you look further down the page, let's say you've added nickel in the form of a nickel sulfate, you might find that there is an aqueous nickel sulfate species. So which means that even if you added nickel sulfate as a solid, you've seen your solution turn green, you're like, well, that's fully dissolved. It doesn't mean that there is no aqueous complex between the nickel and the salt that it just came from. Okay? And we can't know in advance whether, for example, in the solution that we've just made, are we going to have nickel 2+, are we going to have more nickel sulfate, the aqueous, or is it all going to be nickel hydroxide? How do we know? Right? So that's the question. So if we just forget the complex for a moment and just look at these basic two species, nickel 2+ and the other one that's in the same oxidation state, we know that we have a system where these two species can possibly exist. Now, we want nickel 2+, and I'll show why in a minute, but we need to figure out how this equilibrium between these two species is actually determined. And the way to go about that is to write the reaction, or rather, yes, the chemical equilibrium between these two species. So we can see that nickel hydroxide, looking at this equilibrium, will exist predominantly at a more alkaline pH. and it needs to be acidified to go back to nickel 2+. So this is what that shows. So what this immediately tells us is that at more alkaline pH, you're not going to have very much of this nickel 2+, and you're going to have this hydroxide stuff, which you probably don't want. So if you've written out the equilibrium, you then go to that textbook that I just showed you, and you write down all of the Gibbs free energies for all of the species, right? And you put them into this equation to work out the overall Gibbs free energy change of this reaction. Okay, so that involves the stoichiometry of the reacting species and their Gibbs free energies. Okay, and that overall Gibbs free energy change of this reaction can allow you to determine the equilibrium constant for this reaction. And so if we do it for the exact reaction that I've put in at the top, we've got our Gibbs free energy of our products, which is nickel hydroxide and protons, minus the Gibbs free energy of the reactants, which is nickel 2+ and water. So like this, that one bites the dust because that's the Gibbs free energy of protons is 0. So you can ultimately work it out. And then when you write out the equilibrium constant in a different way, the equilibrium constant is actually a fraction between the product of the products and the reactants. So the activity coefficients of all of these species raised to their molar stoichiometry, right? So you can essentially relate the concentrations or the activities, but at concentrations of the different species to the overall thermodynamics of that reaction, okay? So what do we actually get from that? So we can really simplify that reaction, by the way, because there are certain rules that allow you to get rid of lots of unknown activities, such as, for example, water. So water is a solvent. The activity of a solvent is always 1. And nickel hydroxide is a solid. It's crystalline. And the activities of solids is also 1. So that really allows us to simplify the problem down to this equation. So the equilibrium constant for this reaction is the ratio of the concentration, or rather activity, of protons raised to the power of 2 divided by nickel concentration, and then the equilibrium constant, which we know from our Gibbs free energy change of the reaction. So this allows us to see the relationship between the nickel 2+ concentration in solution and pH. And if we plot the nickel concentration as a function of pH, we can get a plot if we rearrange it like this. So the plot looks like that. So you can see that nickel 2+ activity is indeed very highly influenced by pH. So the more acidic the pH, the higher the nickel 2+ activity, and the higher the pH, the higher the fraction of nickel OH2. We don't want nickel OH2 in our plating. We don't want any hydroxides at all when we do plating, because when you deposit from an aqueous species like nickel 2+, or perhaps some sort of aqueous complex, we can get a nice nickel deposit. When we form nickel hydroxide, it does this to the electrode. So it's a highly resistive, non-reactive sludge, right? And this is true for nickel, but also for many other metals. So you don't want iron oxides, you don't want hydroxides of anything, because this is what they look like. So the first thing that this kind of very basic speciation calculation teaches us is that for electrodeposition of pure metals from a very simple solution, we want to stick to the acidic region, right? So that's the conclusion of that. But if you look at this diagram, it's a little bit strange because, okay, at low pH, we've got a nickel activity of 10 to the 12. That's not really very realistic. So this calculation is not constrained at the moment by the total amount of the salt that we actually put into the solution in the first place. So let's say I make a plating bath with 1 mole of nickel 2+, right? That's it. The activity of nickel 2+ cannot exceed that value that I've just put in, because where's it going to come from? So the way to constrain this calculation is to impose a limit on the nickel 2+ concentration. So, or activity. I use concentration and activity interchangeably here, although Jason Riley would probably be very angry with me for doing that. But for the time being, you know, for simplicity for now, because I don't want this discussion particularly to go on for hours and hours, I use them interchangeably. So I need to constrain this nickel 2 plus activity / concentration to the amount that I've actually put into the solution. And this involves doing a mathematical trick where you impose a limit using this mathematical manipulation, right? So if the quantity that you're calculating is limited by a physical constant B, and the B is what you put into the solution, in this case it's 1 mole, this is the mathematical equation using which you impose that limit. So you can do that to any equation. For example, if you have the Butler-Volmer equation, which predicts current density as a function of potential, it goes on indefinitely, you know, exponentially up and up and up, unless you limit it here by the mass transport limited value, right? So this is how it's done. So once you've done that, you get a nice plot of nickel concentration as a function of pH, where you can see that up until pH 6 or so, you have nickel 2 plus as the predominant species in solution, and subsequently it becomes nickel hydroxide. So that equilibrium pH will change depending on concentration. So this particular plot is for a nickel concentration of 1 mole, but that equilibrium will shift depending on what you've put in. Okay? So this once again tells us that, okay, we want to be constrained to the acidic region, but we probably want to be more like at pH negative of pH 5 or something like that, right? And realistically, if you look at any reports of nickel plating baths that don't contain complexing agents, which I'll go into in a bit, it's never at a pH that's higher than 4.5, because you don't want to risk getting that horrible hydroxide on your surface. Okay. So then you can do the same approach, use the same approach of basically writing out the chemical reactions for anything that you might expect in your solution. So if you're expecting more complexes to form or something else, you include them in that total mass balance, right? And then you write down all the chemical equilibria and solve for the speciation. So you've got an extra reaction now, okay? So you can not only make nickel hydroxide, but also nickel OH+. So you do the same thing as we did for the hydroxide. You go through the writing out and calculating the equilibrium constant, getting rid of any unknowns. And when you solve for the speciation, this is what you get. So again, we've put in a total of concentration of nickel equals 1 mole, and we can see that yes, we do have some presence of a complex in the solution, but it's never the dominant form of nickel, right? So it does form at the sort of equilibrium line, but it doesn't dominate the system. And you can do this based on basically what you've put in. So if you've put in nickel in the form of and chloride and sulfate, and you've put in some boric acid, you will expect certain complexes to form, and if you've got the Gibbs free energy data for those complexes, you will be able to work out how they affect the nickel speciation and at what pH they're present. So from this particular diagram, we can see that out of all of these complexes, nickel chloride actually is the one that isn't almost zero, right? Because it does in fact reduce the activity of nickel 2 plus in the acidic region by 10%. But the other stuff like nickel sulfate and the nickel boric complexes, they don't do very much. Okay, so it still tells us what we want to know. You then get more complex systems, which involve 2 mass balances. And this is what happens when you have deliberately added complexing agents. And the purpose of complexing agents is to try and push the solubility limit of nickel 2 into the alkaline region. And I'll show why later. But let's say you looked at the previous speciation diagram and you're like, well, I need to do the plating ideally at pH 8, but the nickel becomes horrible sludge at pH 8. What can I do to stop the sludge from forming? that's when you add a complexing agent. And this includes anything that you will frequently come across in plating baths, like citric acid or citrate, and ammonia, right? And the idea is that they complex the metal to such an extent that it stops the hydroxide from forming. And you can have this wider range of plating bath conditions under which you can do electrodeposition or whatever. And so to bring that in, if you have a deliberately added complexing agent, you have to do the mass balance on the metal and on the complexing agents, because you have these two common, the species, the complexes are common to both mass balances. So if you want to solve this, you have to use some sort of solver. I do this using GPROMs, but basically you can start to see these interesting complexes forming, which if we zoom into them, we can see that if we add nickel and ammonia, for example, we have this phase where, as expected, at about pH 6, we go from nickel 2 plus to nickel hydroxide. But then at about pH 9, that redissolves, and nickel is present in the form of these aqueous complexes with ammonia, two different ones. And the presence of those complexes depends on how much nickel and how much of the complexing agent you've got in solution. So if you add too little ammonia, that disappears and you have precipitation. If you add lots of excess ammonia, you start to have something like this. So this allows you to play around with the solution so that you can get it to the composition that you want, and you don't end up ruining your procedure. Right, so I think I've hopefully made it clear how, even before we get to the electrochemistry stuff, how just the chemical speciation of the solution, or rather understanding why you're putting certain things into the electrolyte, why it's important to do that. And in my group now, I'll show you some of Namkang's work, but Namkang is now working with nickel systems where you have ammonia and citrate. So the number of complexes that are formed, it's quite scary almost how many, but it essentially keeps the nickel 2 in aqueous soluble form right up until pH 11. So that allows some flexibility with the electroplating conditions. Right, so now moving on to how to control the actual electrochemical reactions. We've identified the pH regions and the conditions that are suitable for plating. Now we have to understand the electrochemistry. So this is where predicting the potentials at which reactions become thermodynamically feasible becomes very important, right? So I'm sure, I guess you will have all in some form heard of the Nernst potential. That is essentially the equilibrium potential for a particular reaction. At that potential, the net rate of the reaction is 0, and if you push the potential away from that equilibrium, you're likely to get a reaction. So you want to essentially build a map of potentials for all the different reactions that you expect to occur, so that you know what to apply, you know how to control the reaction. And it tells you not only how to control the reaction of interest, but it tells you what other side reactions you might expect at the same time, and what the consequences of that would be. So how do we calculate that? Everybody's favorite, potential pH diagrams. This is something, potential pH diagrams, I think, are one of the most hated things in electrochemistry in my experience, but they are incredibly, incredibly useful. Jeff Kelsall, who is my PhD supervisor, has potential pH diagrams in Excel spreadsheets. And we've always hated them with a passion, but actually it turned out to be the absolute best way of understanding how to make them. And now we rely on them all the time. And now I'm making my own new ones. So they're really important. So from last year, I'm quite comfortable that I can talk about potential pH diagrams, because the responses showed that generally there is sufficient knowledge of what potential pH diagrams are to understand what I'm about to show. But if you're using water as a solvent, the basis of starting to map out the electrochemistry of your system is to put put in the Nernst potentials of water, right, for water reduction to hydrogen and water oxidation to oxygen, because those reactions will always be relevant in an aqueous system, right? I've plotted these here. I don't know if you find it confusing or not, but usually these diagrams are plotted versus the standard hydrogen electrode. So you would have seen the blue lines, which show the Nernst potentials for water reduction and oxidation as a function of pH. But recently, like more and more often, we start to see experimental results presented relative to the reversible hydrogen electrode rather than the standard hydrogen electrode, mostly for hydrogen generation applications, where this diagram is basically sufficient to do what you're doing. And the purpose of the reversible hydrogen electrode is basically because the Nernst potential is constant with pH, so you can plot all your kinetics in a more consistent way. But anyway, so that's the basis of the potential pH diagram for any aqueous system. And then on top of that, we start to apply the reactions that might occur with our metals for electrodeposition. So this is an example that I'm showing here is again for nickel, because it makes my life easier and I feel more in my comfort zone with this particular reaction. But you start to write down possible electrochemical reactions, and the usual starting point for that is to consult the electrochemical series, which presents some of the most common electrochemical reactions. And the one that we're actually interested in if we're trying to plate nickel is nickel 2 plus 2 electrons goes to elemental nickel. So simple. And then we start to work out what the equilibrium potential for this reaction is. And we do that using some standard formulae that you'll find in any textbook, which is that, again, we use the Gibbs free energy change for this reaction, divided by the electron stoichiometry of the reaction, and that gives us the standard potential. So the standard potential doesn't take into account the experimental conditions, so it doesn't take into account, for example, the concentration of nickel 2 plus, which we've just discovered is actually very important. So to get an equilibrium potential that's more relevant to the system, we extend the standard potential, or rather we correct it based on what we've got in solution. So this is the official formula. I'm not going to go into it too much, but you can see that in addition to the standard potential, the correction term involves the concentrations of the products and the reactants for this particular electrochemical reaction. So if you have 1 mole of nickel, you can get your reversible potential. And when you've done that for all the possible reactions between all the possible species in the system, I'm jumping a little bit ahead now, but it looks something like this. So we can see that within the range of nickel 2 plus, which is where we want to do our plating from, the reaction from nickel 2 plus to nickel is pH independent, but it bisects this Nernst potential for the hydrogen reaction. So we can say a few things, again, based on this diagram. We know that we don't want to be anywhere, if we don't have complexing agents, we don't want to be in the alkaline region, we don't want any hydroxides, we don't want to oxidize the nickel 2 plus, we want to reduce it to some lovely shiny nickel. So this automatically, constrains our conditions. And now we're starting to look, okay, what potential should we apply to get our nickel to get reduced and deposited? So we can see that although pH isn't, protons aren't directly involved in the reduction of nickel 2 plus to nickel, we can see that thermodynamically the two reduction reactions are actually going to compete depending on what pH you choose. So at very acidic conditions, we can see that proton reduction to hydrogen is more thermodynamically feasible than the reduction of nickel 2 plus. So it doesn't tell us anything about kinetics or how fast these processes will be, and it depends on what electrode we use and so on. But it does tell us that we can expect some fierce competition between these two reactions. And when we're actually trying to plate something, we don't really want any side reactions. We don't want hydrogen bubbles evolving because we want a nice shiny metal, and we don't want anything else. So this potential pH diagram tells us that probably we don't want to be in the overly acidic conditions. But at the same time, at around pH 4 is where we want to investigate our reaction. We don't want to go too close to pH 6 because we don't want to risk precipitation. And we don't want to go too acidic either. Oh, I put this in the wrong place. I guess the way, about the complexing agents, I was going to show, and let me actually see, does that show up on the,
No.
okay. Let me share the screen for a second. Yes, so this is on the topic of complexing agents. I guess the point was that I want to show how the different solution chemistries can affect the potential pH diagrams. And what's loading very slowly is an app that a Europe student did 2 years ago and another student continued since, that allows you to interactively explore the effect of different complexants on potential pH diagrams without going through the time-consuming process of actually drawing them out in Excel. So this is an example of a nickel and ammonia system. And what we can do is set the ammonia concentration to 0, and then we're down to our standard nickel potential pH diagram that we've seen before. So we can see that if we reduce the nickel concentration, that equilibrium pH shifts. And now we want to see what happens if we gradually start adding ammonia. So let's say we add a bit. Okay. It does change the speciation, but it doesn't change the potential pH diagram. The potential pH diagram only includes species that are predominant in the solution. So it's not for all species that exist in the solution. It's only for species that have the highest concentration. Okay, so even though we're starting to have, we can see we're having some small peaks at the bottom from these complexes that have started to form. It's not predominant yet. So we can start increasing the ammonia concentration and increasing. And when we're really in excess with ammonia, we can see that we've now introduced this region of solubility that breaks up this NiOH2 dominance. And that's reflected in the potential pH diagram in that purple spot, which says that, okay, if you're between pH something like 8.7 and 10.5, you're actually going to have soluble nickel 2, and you can do your plating there. And that explains some of the approaches that many authors have taken in the literature. And if you add more excess ammonia, you widen that region of solubility. Okay, so this potential pH diagrams, these online forms, I mean, in addition to changing the style a bit, I'm hoping to continue developing them for all kinds of systems, and hopefully they'll be useful. But anyway, back to the presentation. 1 second, let me just upload everything again. Oops. Please. No. 1 second. Can I?
Yes.
Oh, okay, cool. Having shown you the automated thing for the ammonia, I'll now just show you just one more, and then I'll stop torturing you with potential pH diagrams. The one for nickel citrate. So you can see that if you add citrate to a nickel bath, you really extend the solubility region above pH 8. So that explains why in papers they sometimes add a combination of citrate and ammonia to plating baths, because you get rid of that region of NiOH2 completely until you get to superalkaline pH. We've yet to, Namkang is going to construct a combined diagram for nickel citrate and ammonia, And then we'll see what that looks like, because that's the deposition system that he's experimenting with. And this is just to show that you can have not only nickel, you can do it for basically anything. This is an example for zinc, this is an example for copper, and so on. Okay, so I've mentioned, or rather I tried to start showing why it's important to look at side reactions, right? So, and we've seen that if we stick to the acidic pH in just a normal nickel system without any complexing agents, we can expect some competition between the reduction of nickel and the reduction of protons or water to hydrogen. And sometimes, for example, for copper, that competition is not so severe, because we can see that the reduction potential from copper 2+ to copper is actually more thermodynamically favorable than hydrogen evolution reactions. So we can plate copper without the influence of hydrogen, but for nickel, we can't. So we're going to have these two parallel processes happening. So why is that bad? It's bad for several reasons. So one is that you're going to be wasting energy on a reaction that you don't want, right? Some of the current that's going to be flowing through the substrate that you're trying to coat with lovely nickel is going to be lost on another process that you don't want, right? So this means that you're wasting energy. The other reason is that if you're evolving, for example, hydrogen on your surface, you're consuming protons close to the surface. That means that your pH locally to the surface is going to increase. So you're going to have non-constant conditions if the concentrations of things are changing at your electrode surface. And secondly, we've also seen the effect of increasing pH. So that's how you end up with that greeny nickel hydroxide sludge on your electrode, is if you let the local pH get too high. Your overall pH might be fine, you might be at pH 4.5, but if you're pushing the reaction too fast and you've got hydrogen evolving, the local pH is going to increase and you might end up with some precipitation, right? And finally, if you're evolving lots of bubbles on your surface and they don't break off immediately, the deposit is kind of going to they will block the electrode surface, right? So if a bubble is sitting on a surface, that contact area is not going to be covered by the reducing metal because the contact is broken with the solution. And indeed that happens, and I'll show you an example, like a picture of what happens when you let lots of hydrogen bubbles evolve. So there are lots of reasons why you want to avoid side reactions. And so ultimately, the amount of metal that you're going to get for the charge that you pass through the surface will depend on the charge yield of your reaction. So if for example, 50% of your current is going to nickel reduction, but 50% is being wasted on hydrogen evolution, this phi, which is the charge yield, is going to be 1/2, right? So you can see that you're going to be passing charge, but only half of it will be effective. And you can find out the charge if you measure the mass of the deposit, you know how much charge you passed, and so you can reorganize this equation to calculate the efficiency of deposition, which is really important to know regardless of whether you're recovering nickel or just depositing it. Okay, so this is an example of what happens when you co-evolve lots of hydrogen together with nickel reduction, right? So this is a particular type of electrode I'll explain later, but here I'm just, you just have to look at the metallic bit in the middle where the deposit is formed. So you can see these kind of circles on an otherwise metallic substrate in the first image, and that's because that part of the surface was covered with hydrogen bubbles for a long time, right? So the bubbles didn't break off, the deposit formed around it, and if you push the reaction to even like more negative potentials, you start to have a chemical change occurring at the surface as well. So if you're expecting lovely shiny nickel, this is an example of when you don't get the lovely shiny nickel. Okay, and that's for several reasons, and all of this could be obviated if you look at potential pH diagrams and do a study of kinetics based on those diagrams. Okay. I mean, it won't be totally avoided, these kind of things, but at least you won't be constantly getting bad results and wondering why. All right. Another example. I really love this because I don't actually think I've ever seen nickel that color, but this is Namkang experimenting with the addition of different complexing agents, and this is an example of when you haven't added enough complexing agent and you still want your solution to be at pH 8, right? So definitely not something you want, and definitely not something you want on your electrode surface. Also miscalculating the amount of supporting electrolyte by not looking at the solubility limit of the salt you're adding. So the point is that chemistry and electrochemistry are just are very linked, and thermodynamic predictions are, you know, you really can't do without them. But anyway, this is quite funny. I really enjoyed these pictures. So just a quick note then about studying kinetics, right? So the Nernst potential tells you when you should get zero net current from a particular electrochemical reaction. It should be in equilibrium, right? So if you're having nickel 2 plus goes to nickel naught, at the equilibrium potential, the nickel naught is not oxidized. The nickel naught oxidation and nickel 2 plus reduction are in equilibrium. It doesn't mean that there aren't tiny currents from the reverse and forward reactions, but the net reaction is zero. And to trigger a reaction, you have to apply something called an overpotential, which is that you control the potential of your electrode to go away from that Nernst potential, right? So here is an example of what happens if you go in the direction of reduction or oxidation. This is not for nickel. This is just a kind of a, let's say, standardized, just a shape-based prediction of what you might expect. So as you move away from the overpotential, you start to measure a current. If your kinetics are good, you measure current almost straight away, like if you're trying to reduce protons on platinum. Or you could have really sluggish kinetics if the surface isn't catalyzing the reaction well. Yep, question?
Sorry, can you make the slide bigger on the screen here?
I would if I knew how to do it.
Minimize the participants and
I think it's that button and
Which one?
it's in Teams.
Okay.
On the left of the cursor.
This one?
Yeah,
Yes.
High frequencies.
Yes.
Better?
yeah, better. And maybe if you just close the participants.
Yeah.
Yes.
There we go.
It makes the recording.
Can you still see online? All right.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
That's all right.
Right. So, and we start to look at the kinetics. So where we have zero is the electrode potential that we predicted from our potential pH diagram. Okay. So you have several regimes in how the current changes in response to an applied potential. Okay. Oops. So the first regime is this one that's very close to the overpotential, which is where you don't get a very high current. And it's quite slow. So this is for small overpotentials, typically, you know, up to maybe 100 millivolts or a little larger, depending on how good the catalysis is. And the reaction rate is controlled more or less exclusively by the rate of electron transfer. Right? And then as you increase the overpotential, so you're trying to drive the reaction faster, you reach something called mixed control, which is where the rate is determined by the competition between the rate of electron transfer and the diffusion of species from the bulk of the solution to the electrode surface. So for example, if you're reducing nickel ions or any other ions, once you reduce them at the interface, they have to be replenished by ions coming from the bulk of the solution. So if that diffusion process is slow, you will start to see it influence the current that is measured. And the reason for this plateau, the reason for why you can't just keep increasing the overpotential and your current density just keeps increasing and increasing forever, is because at some point the rate of diffusion is going to limit the current regardless of overpotential, right? And it's important to know at which potentials for a particular system you reach this mass transport control, because you can see if you start applying a high over potential, you're just wasting the energy because you're not going to get anything more from your reaction. So you need to know essentially where the limitations are for the system, whether you're reducing or oxidizing something. All right. And this is where the difficulty with determining the kinetics of metal reduction come from when you have unwanted side reactions happening at the same time. Oh, this is really blurry indeed. I'm sorry for that. But this is just an illustration of the importance of this interface between the electrode and the bulk solution, right? When you're driving a reaction, you know, at well, at any rate actually, but especially at a high rate, you start to have a gradient, a concentration gradient develop between the reactant in the bulk and the reactant at the surface. And that's the part that limits the maximum current density. And you can increase it, increase the current, so you can play with it. It's not something that you can't control. Up to a point, you can control the mass transport limited current density if you start to disturb this diffusion layer. So you want that diffusion layer not to grow, because it will actually grow with time if you don't impose any hydrodynamic control. So if you're starting to flow your solution, or you introduce turbulence, like even something basic like you use a stirrer in your electrochemical cell, you will increase the mass transport coefficient, which is a ratio between the diffusion coefficient of your species and the thickness of this diffusion layer. And you will reduce this diffusion layer thickness and you increase your mass transport control. So if you are able to play around with mass transport, you can start to affect where that mass transport limited current density is, right? So the more turbulent your solution, the faster you're flowing it, the higher that maximum current density that you can extract. So if you're really looking like I did in my nickel recovery to try and recover the nickel as quickly as possible, you want to increase that rate of mass transport and drive the reaction close to mass transport. But then you've seen the kind of morphology that you get as a result of that. So if you want a nice smooth deposit, you don't actually want to go to those regimes. But in order to not go to those regimes, you still have to know where they are, at what potentials, and at what current densities. Okay, so the one way that I guess some of you will be familiar with, whether you're doing electrodeposition or something else, is imposing such mass transport in a very reproducible way using a 3-electrode system where the working electrode is a rotating disc, right? What is a rotating disc electrode? It's basically a metallic rod embedded in an insulating sheath, such that at the bottom, at the tip of that electrode, you have a very precise area of this metallic disc exposed, right? And you can polish that and get it to a nice smooth finish. And basically, you're always having the same electrode area for the investigations. And when you look at the side view, essentially, you've got the rod embedded in the sheath, and then you have an electronic contact going all the way to the top so that you can make a crocodile clip connection. And you can predict the effect of the rotation rate of such a disk on the mass transport coefficient for the species in your solution in a way that you can predict your mass transport limited current density as a function of the rotation of the disk. So you can buy these disks together with the rotators, so you set the rotation speed, and that essentially enables you to estimate what's the maximum mass transport rate for your reaction. So this is all nice and well, but this is what happens, for example, when I did this experiment with my nickel solution. This is one of my earliest measurements. You can even see there's some noise in there and so on. But I basically calculated where the Nernst potential should be for my system, a particular concentration of nickel. I calculated that it should be at about minus 0.5 volts. SCE stands for calomel electrode, which aren't sold anymore because they've got mercury in them, but they were awfully nice. In fact, if anyone knows where we can source a calomel electrode, please put it in the chat. So we start there, and what we do is we start to see, okay, when do we get some reduction? So we scan the potential. This is a technique called cyclic voltammetry. We go negative. We try and get some reduction. Oh, we get a current. We then get to minus 1.1 volt and reverse the direction of the scan. The current is larger over a wide potential range because nickel, you now have a nickel surface on the electrode, and it catalyzes nickel reduction better than whatever was there before. And then we oxidize that deposit to try and see from that oxidation peak. We're assuming that all the nickel has re-oxidized, and we're trying to see how much of that current density that we've just passed is actually going towards nickel and how much towards hydrogen, because it turns out that even if you rotate the electrode, you can't see any plateau. Not from hydrogen, not from nickel, and this is quite a common observation. And when you see that, that's when you get really lost. And it's like, well, okay. And another problem with redissolving the deposit is that when you look at the electrode afterwards, you can see that a lot of the deposit's still there, so it's never 100% efficient. So this kind of, the rotating disc thing is fine, but if you're trying to understand exactly at what potential your reduction actually starts to happen at some acceptable rate, this doesn't help you because you still don't know what's what. So it is good if you can see any sign of mass transport, because from the magnitude you can relate it. You can say, okay, we have this concentration of protons, we have this concentration of nickel, this mass transport has to be protons based on the concentrations. You can at least try and kind of distinguish the processes from each other, but if you can't see mass transport and the kinetics are slow, you're kind of in the woods. So one way of probing the reaction is, instead of doing the potential sweep over this massive potential range, right? Look, we've gone from between minus 1.1 and 0.3 here. So that's 1.4 volts of a sweep. That's massive, right? So we can do it more systematically, which is where we calculate our Nernst potential, marked here as J equals 0, right? And we apply that to the electrode. We expect nothing to happen. And then we start to apply an overpotential, but a really, really small one. Like such a small overpotential that we don't expect it to do very much, but what we do is we go apply an overpotential, cycle back to the starting point, and then we apply a larger overpotential and cycle back. And what that enables us to do is to see at which potential certain things start to happen. And this applies not just for metal electrodeposition, but to a whole load of other systems. And I will show here an example, not from electrodeposition, but from a corrosion study that Samara Sadiq, who's graduated now, did. The difference, so as we progress from graph A, B, C, D, E to F, we can see that the individual colors for the sweeps, the limit is increasing every single time. And you can start to see that things start to happen, actually. So first, we do the first two sweeps. Okay, something, but nothing much. And then we get to the next potential, and oh, there is like a redissolution reaction going back. And we can see that actually quite a lot of things start to happen. And this way we can start detecting at which potential certain reactions might have their onset. So it's not, it might not work. But for some things, this procedure works really well, rather than just measuring a really long sweep and then like, okay, some peaks formed here, some peaks formed on the reverse, but a lot of reactions might have happened by the time you got to the reverse scan. So this is a way of being a bit more systematic with that. This may help or this may not help. The thing that we're investigating a lot at the moment, so I tried this during my PhD, but not very much. But now we've equipped ourselves with a ton of crystals, so this is a technique we're really going for. It's called an electrochemical crystal microbalance. We have a Metro Multilab potentiostat, and this is a kind of a, what's it called, like a module that you can buy with that. So you can control the electrode in the same way that you'd control any electrode. You can, you could do cyclic voltammetry on it, but at the same time, you can measure, or you can determine at the same time the amount of mass that has accumulated on that electrode. So the way it works is that you have an electrode that's deposited on a quartz crystal. So the bare quartz crystal has metallic plates. It's sandwiched between metallic plates. And you can set up a standing wave through a frequency perturbation, right? And if you start to deposit additional mass onto such an electrode, the standing wave frequency will shift. And this module for electrochemical quartz is actually able to detect a shift in frequency. So what we expect is basically if we've just got some hydrogen evolution, we don't expect that to constitute a mass forming on an electrode surface. So we would measure, let's say, lots of current, but no frequency change. And that's when we'd know, okay, that part of the current was all hydrogen, and there we were thinking it was nickel. So it can allow you to distinguish between different things. The only thing that it can't do is impose mass transport. So you can't have all in one unless Anthony is either on the call or listens to this later, who can think about how to combine an electrochemical quartz crystal microbalance with a defined mass transport situation. But we're trying to use this now to try and determine the efficiency of the deposition process. So this is Namkang. He's sitting in the audience here, and this is all of his work, and some of the really cool pictures before were his work as well. This is an example of a voltammogram that Namkang obtained. So it's actually a currents measured at fixed potential, so it wasn't quite a sweep, it was more sort of potentiostatic measurements of current versus potential. This is all on an electrochemical quartz crystal microbalance. So we've got this curve, again, the one that doesn't tell us hydrogen or nickel, right? But by measuring the change in frequency of the electrode, we can actually estimate the amount of mass that has deposited at each potential. And this allows us to see that, okay, for this particular system, the Nernst potential is at minus 0.4 volts, which is where the experiment started, and you've got next to no mass and zero charge yield. And then it takes us all the way up to about minus 0.9 volts before we start to have some appreciable deposition. So if we know the amount of mass that's been deposited, we'll know what fraction of current went to nickel reduction in this particular case. And so the idea is that you then do these experiments all on a crystal microbalance and so on. So how do you then, apply this to real electrodes that you actually want to coat and then give them some sort of application? Well, Namkang originally followed papers, let's say, that gave certain conditions. Let's say, apply this voltage or apply this current density, and applied that to some of his electrodes, which he's making for use in an alkaline water electrolyzer. So this is carbon cloth, and the idea is to use carbon cloth as a porous, both an electrode and a porous transport layer for an electrolyzer. And the way to make it porous is you use a porous substrate like carbon, which is not very appropriate, but coat it with a catalyst, in this case nickel. And so before these results were generated, Namkang applied minus 2.5 volts to deposit nickel. And nickel did deposit, but you can see that the deposit is really low quality. And when you look at the results from the electrochemical quartz crystal microbalance, you can see that you're just applying way too much over potential. The nickel deposition is probably all finished, and you're starting to get more hydrogen evolution, which is ruining everything. And then when the conditions became a little bit more appropriate, and based on the results that were obtained with a crystal microbalance, the deposit was much better. So these measurements essentially allow you to determine the best. The predictions allow you to predict the best plating conditions, and the kinetic measurements allow you to really pinpoint the best potential current density that you might want to actually use on a real electrode. Is there something in the chat?
Professor Kusanek.
Yes, it's a bit. Ooh. Oh, okay.
QCM.
A wall jet. Yeah, Anthony, I'll have to listen to your lecture again, because I remember you talked about it in the kinetics lecture you gave earlier in this course, and I remember Namkang and I smiling when we pictured lots of nickel flying, being jetted around the lab. But thank you very much. I guess I'll read this after I finish with my lecture. Otherwise, I won't get to the bottom of it. But so what we're now.
Chat at some point if you want, anyway.
Yes, please. Thank you, Anthony. I think that would be very useful, because kind of going a little bit out of my depth now, and if, yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So now just the kind of coming to the last part that we're now really exploring. This is new territory for us. So Namkang, who's, as I said, is in the audience, the original point of his PhD was to try and tailor-make nickel geometries for use in alkaline electrolyzers, but to do this using a 3D printer. So to use a 3D printer to generate a very specific nickel electrode morphology. But because of COVID and because Namkang was stuck abroad for more than a year during lockdown, and when he came back, the printer hadn't been serviced and kind of a bit broken as well, we changed the focus of his work to use porous substrates such as carbon felt and carbon cloth instead as templates, and coat them with catalysts by electrodeposition. So we're back with my lab being full of nickel. And Namkang read a lot of literature and actually concluded that a nickel molybdenum alloy might do a better job than just nickel alone. And so now he's investigating the co-deposition of nickel and molybdenum. So if you've seen how tricky it is to try and understand nickel electrodeposition, this part is becoming even more complicated, because you have two metals depositing, and you have different stages of deposition and electron transfer, and different intermediates catalyze different reactions, and all of this is competing with hydrogen. So there's a lot of competition between adsorbed species on the surface and all kinds of things, and it's all sensitive to the composition of the bulk solution as well. Right, so the thing about molybdenum by itself is that it's quite a tricky metal. This has been known for quite a while now. And so elemental deposition of molybdenum is extremely difficult because of certain properties that it has. And the form in which molybdenum normally comes from a salt, it has an oxidation state of 6+, so it requires, unlike nickel, which requires 2 electrons for the reduction, this one requires 6. But what's normally observed is that at a smaller overpotential, you get a 2 electron transfer instead, and you get this molybdenum oxide forming. Now, oxides aren't amazing, as we sort of discussed. So Namkang is currently trying to understand how to get elemental molybdenum rather than the oxide form, because it's quite difficult to distinguish between the two using XRD. And so quite likely you get molybdenum oxide forming preferentially before you get to molybdenum, but you can't tell from the measured current whether you've had that conversion between molybdenum oxide to elemental molybdenum or not. So Namkang is now using a mixture of electrochemical quartz crystal microbalance and looking at the deposit using scanning electron microscopy and energy dispersive spectroscopy to try and actually see what the composition of the deposit is. So this requires essentially sacrificing an EQCM, a quartz crystal, pair applied potential from solution. So you code the electrode with one potential, you measure the current, and you then measure the mass change, and you then see the composition of the electrode, which is going to be part nickel, part molybdenum. And using that compositional information, you back calculate how much of the mass deposit must be due to nickel and due to molybdenum. But the molybdenum part is difficult because you don't know whether you've got molybdenum or molybdenum oxide. And so we're trying to piece together all of this in situ and ex situ information to try and identify the best plating bath and the best deposition condition at which you get the right ratio of nickel and molybdenum. And Namkang originally used a plating bath consisting of a nickel salt, a molybdenum salt, and boric acid in the acidic range, but found that he couldn't really get any kind of deposit that he actually wanted. So now he's gone into this lovely situation of adding complexing agents, including citrate and ammonia. So now we're in these potential pH diagrams, except we're trying to find out the data to make corresponding plots for molybdenum in addition to nickel. So if you don't, the reason why Namkhang couldn't get good deposits with using boric acid and avoiding the citrate is because if you don't have citrate, you start to form some inactive compounds, and through the addition of citrate, you get the right speciation, is what's been discovered through some experiments, no less, so not just theoretically. But Namkhang is using this potential pH diagram for nickel to try and understand the choices of, why in publications people report certain pHs, certain concentrations. So we're trying to link all of this back to what we already know. And he's now trying to understand what is actually happening in his system, the possibilities being that you have nickel-ammonia complexes independently reducing to nickel, whether you have citrate complexes also reducing to nickel, whether you have molybdenum citrate complexes reducing to molybdenum oxide, or whether you have this mixed situation where you have this kind of weird combined catalysis. So whether we'll get to the bottom of it, we'll see, but we're trying to do this using the electrochemical quartz crystal microbalance and ex situ analysis and some thermodynamic predictions. So Namkhang's understood a lot through successes and failures, which is that you get a really nice deposit with a particular plating bath that involves both citrate and ammonia. These fibers that are shown in the SEM image are carbon cloth, yes, being coated, and the table below shows the molar ratio of nickel to molybdenum. So it's that kind of information from which we calculate the individual charge yields of nickel reduction and molybdenum reduction, and we have to make a guess whether molybdenum underwent a 2-electron reduction or a 6-electron reduction. So jury's still out, I think. And then trying, okay, well, let's just leave the ammonia out, because we realize that the presence of ammonia makes our silver-silver chloride reference electrode quite unhappy, which is why we went back to older papers, which all use calomel. So now we're sort of umming and ahhing about what to do, but not including ammonia clearly makes it all, makes a not nice deposit, and the same trying to avoid citrate doesn't give a very good deposit. So we're still doing a lot of work on trying to identify the best plating bath and understanding the best conditions, but I've basically explained how we're doing that. So my final slide is just to go over what are the ways in which you can control electrodeposition if you are just trying to get a nice thin deposit on your electrode and that's all you want to do. What are the options? So there are 3 main options. One is that you use a constant potential. So you have your potential pH diagram, which is a map that tells you which conditions to use. You can refer to that, select the optimum potential. You can determine it experimentally and so on. It's not so applying a constant potential isn't the way that plating is done industrially. So because to control a particular electrode potential, you need a reference electrode, and that's quite a costly thing that you only really do on your small lab scale. So, for example, the nickel electroplating that I showed for the Royal Mint was done at constant current. But a constant potential, essentially, it allows you to map where you are. So constant current is more common industrially, and if you know exactly the charge yield of your reaction, or you know that you have no side reactions, if you apply a constant current, that guarantees a constant deposition rate. If you apply a constant potential, you never measure a completely constant current. It kind of goes up and down depending on how the surface is evolving, how any diffusion gradients are forming. So there are lots of things that can make that quite hard to interpret. At constant current, you get constant deposition, unless you start to have strange competition between various reactions that start to change your local pH, and then all of that goes skew with. But besides the constant conditions, you can do what is done at the Royal Mint, which is pulsing. So in the Royal Mint, the way that they pulse plated their coins, so they did it at constant current, but only with intermittent contact between each coin and the current source. Right, so it's kind of pulse plating, but by moving the substrate rather than controlling the current. But I think that what they do at the Royal Mint has the effect of constantly stirring the solution, which means you don't have the development of these big diffusion gradients, which start to affect the electrochemistry. So if you pulse it and you don't impose hydrodynamic control, you're essentially allowing the diffusion layer to recover rather than constantly growing with time. So doing it slowly and with in a pulsed fashion can allow you to get a smoother deposit that you would otherwise have. So I think that's all I wanted to say. Other than that, I think I probably should have said a little bit more about why mass transport control isn't an ideal condition for generating a really nice deposit. Under mass transport control, the deposit tends to be more dendritic because the electric field, it concentrates at any protrusions on the surface. So if you're driving the reaction super fast, you get preferential deposit in those bits rather than something that happens slowly and smoothly. So for example, with NAMCAN, we want to identify where nickel reduction reaches a non-negligible efficiency, but we don't want to push it to super negative potentials to be as fast as possible, because then he's not going to have a really nice catalyst on the surface. Yeah.